few years, we've seen the demeanor of America and really the Western world changing. I don't know if you've noticed it or not, but it has been changing. Things have been changing quite rapidly, and a couple of those changes are how the words that we use and how we describe and the feelings that we feel and such. There are words that seem to be very prevalent that weren't prevalent maybe 20 years ago, but they are today and in our time. Things like trigger, people getting triggered, right? And safe places and that kind of thing. Anybody ever heard of triggering? Anybody ever heard of safe places? Okay. 20 years ago, I don't know, maybe you have. I didn't necessarily hear about those things back then, but I hear about them all the time now. And really, what has happened in response to this, especially with conservatives, is that conservatives tend to look at that, and rather than try to necessarily understand where they're coming from with those words, we instead just kind of hold our ground, because that's what conservatives do, right? And we hold our ground, and rather than engage, sometimes we'll actually even start calling people names who use these kinds of words. Names like snowflakes, right? And we do that. And I will readily admit that I have that word, I have used that name. But over the last couple of years, I've seen things a little differently. Not a lot differently, just a little differently. Over the last couple of years, I have experienced this triggering effect and the violent anger that has come with it, as well as fear that nothing is safe, nowhere is safe, and most people are not safe. Over the last couple of years, I've seen why that is so, and even though I can only speak about myself, I believe that this is not just with me personally, but with people throughout the world. I think it's the underlying cause for many in this world. I built a house. I built my life, and what I thought was a solid rock, it ended up just being really hardened ground, but not solid rock. In my life, I've experienced some pretty bad storms. I've been hurt many times by the church, by people in the church, not simply just this church, but churches everywhere, because that's what people are. People are sinners, right? And they sin and they hurt. Been hurt significantly when I was in school. I've been hurt by people, by neighbors, right? My dad passed away. A week after I graduated from high school, Katie had a miscarriage. These are all things, these are storms in life that would come up against me. And one by one, I would end up being able to seemingly weather these storms. I kept going, not realizing that I was really just simply on hardened ground, not solid rock, just hardened ground. Not realizing that as more and more storms came my way, that hardened ground began to chip away and began to erode underneath me. I'm not saying that I was an unbeliever. I'm not saying that I was not a believer. I was a believer. I truly believe that I was. But my foundation, that which I had been building my life on, my house on, was not as solid as I thought that it was. And it became apparent in the last 2 years. This morning, as we open up the text, we're looking at this passage that talks about building a house and the need for this house to be built upon the rock, a rock-solid foundation. And as we study this text, I want us to see 3 elements of building a stable home, a stable house, stable life. First element is building the proper mindset. Sorry, Matt. It's coming. Proper mindset, the first one. Second element is building with the proper motives. And then lastly, we see that we need to be building on the proper material. Proper mindset, proper motives, proper material. If you will, please stand with me for the reading of God's Word. Looking at the last 4 verses, 46 through 49. Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and not do what I tell you? Everyone who comes to me and hears my words and does them, I will show you what he is like. He is like a man building a house who dug deep and laid the foundation on the rock. And when a flood arose, the stream broke against the house and could not shake it because it had been well built. But the one who hears and does not do them is like a man who built a house on the ground without a foundation. When the stream broke against it, immediately it fell, and the ruin of that house was great. Thank you. May be seated. So that first element to building a stable home, to building that stable house, a stable life, is that we must first have the proper mindset. You must first have the proper mindset. Look with me, Luke 6:46, one more time. Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and not do what I say or what I tell you? Proper words, but improper motives. Improper mindset here. We call out to Jesus. We will certainly call Jesus Lord. He is Lord, right? He is our rabbi. We are his disciples. He is our king. We are his subjects. He is our Lord, and we are his slaves. We are his bondservants, if you want to say it that way. So to call Jesus Lord certainly is a sign of respect. It's a sign of humility on our part and exaltation for him. It's right to call him Lord. It's true when we call him Lord. But if it isn't followed up with obedience, then it is absolutely meaningless to call him Lord. If you've ever been in charge of something, it doesn't necessarily matter what. But if you've ever been in charge of something, maybe CEO of a company or what have you, or maybe you're the manager on duty at a restaurant or something like that, or even if you're just babysitting, you've got kids that you're in charge of, parents, right? Okay, so it doesn't matter what it is. There is a certain authority that you have being in charge, right? And when people do not listen to you, right? When your supervisors and managers, you're the CEO, supervisors and managers, they don't listen to you, or you're the manager on duty and the staff at the restaurant are not going to listen to you, or you are a parent or you are a babysitter, and you're telling your child, the child, that it's time to go to bed, and they will not listen, but they rebel against you, that is not just frustrating. It is frustrating. It's not just frustrating. It is infuriating, right? It can make you very angry. And so here is Jesus. He says, you're calling me Lord, Lord. You're calling me boss. You're calling me king, right? You're doing the right things, but you're not actually doing what I'm telling you. You're rebelling against what I'm telling you to do. And I don't think that he's yelling at his disciples, but he is certainly confronting his disciples about their disobedience, about where their heart actually lies. He's confronting them with their rebellion that is deep in their hearts. Remember last week we talked about the treasure that's deep in the heart? That treasure is either going to be heavenly treasure, or it's going to be things that Jesus has already put there, and those come out, and the good man, out of the good treasure of his heart, will do good things, and the evil man, out of the evil treasure that's in his heart, will do evil things. And here he is, Jesus is talking to them. He's like, why don't you do what I say? Why is there only evil treasure coming out? Why are you not doing this? As I have told you to do. When he says this, when he asks this question, what we see that every single one of these verbs is in the present tense, it's in the active voice, and it's in the indicative mood. Sometimes you get a Greek lesson and you didn't even know it. Didn't even sign up for it. But here we go. The indicative mood is just simply that it's a fact. Just stating a fact. You're just not doing what I'm telling you to do. You're calling me Lord, Lord, but you're not doing what I'm telling you to do. It's just a fact that he's indicating. It's indicative, right? He's indicating that this is going on. It's active. I mean, in other words, the disciples are the ones that are doing this. This is not happening to the disciples. Nobody's forcing the disciples. Nobody's grabbing the hands of the disciples and causing them to disobey. The disciples are actually the ones that are performing the action here. They're the ones that are doing, or in this case, not doing, on their own accord, what Jesus has told them to do. And it's present. It's present tense, meaning that it's something that is continuously going on or constantly going on. It's consistent. It's not something that they just did in the past. Oh, there was this time where they didn't listen to Jesus. But that's over now. They're listening to him now. No. This is present tense. In other words, this is consistently happening. The disciples are consistently not doing what Jesus has told them to do. They're still doing it, still going on. It's a problem that they're dealing with. And so these disciples are consistently and actively calling Jesus Lord, but also consistently and actively disobeying what he said. They've got the right words, Lord, Lord. But the wrong mindset. I can call him Lord, still live life the way that I want to, still do what I want to do. Their actions are contradicting their words, and it's all wrong. How in the world can we build a stable house, a stable life, if when we go to the architect, we start building it the way that we want rather than the architect tells us to build it? We just ignore the architect. If we're going to build, we have to really build with the proper mindset. Let's look at verse 47 here. Everyone who comes to me and hears my words and does them, I will show you what he is like. So here we have the right mindset. We see these three facets of the right mindset. And before I name them, before we get into them, I just want to point out that these three facets are present, they're active, but they're participles. They're participles. Again, right? So just let's back up. Let's think about this again. Present means what? It's what? Consistently. It's going on right now. Consistent, right? It's going on. Constant thing that's going on. It's consistently going on. It's active, meaning that nobody is doing it to them, but what? They are doing the action themselves. Right? They're the ones that are performing the action. But then we have this participle. And this participle, the aspect of this participle is just simply what we would call the attributive aspect. It's attributing to them what they're doing. It's describing the person. We often see this in English with the ER at the end of words. So a person who is a farmer is one who does what? Farms. Very good, right? So that's kind of how it is. It's this ER thing. So the person who is a cleaner, what? Is one who cleans. Woo, right? Today we have people that are called influencers because they do what? Influence, okay? So that's kind of how the participle, this kind of aspect, attributive participle, it works, kind of like that. And so there are three facets here of a right mindset that Jesus is pointing out that people need to have. First off, the first one is they're a comer. They're comers. They come to Jesus. Being present, consistently coming to Jesus. Being active, nobody is forcing them to come to Jesus. They're coming to Jesus on their own. No one's dragging them. They come on their own accord and they come consistently. So that's who they are. That's the first mindset, the first good mindset, right mindset, come. Be a comer. Second one, they're hearers. They're hearers. They listen to Jesus. They actually hear him. Being present, they're consistently listening to Jesus' words. So they're there, they're coming to Jesus, and they are actually listening to what he has to say. Being active, they're the ones that are actually listening to these words. Nobody's making them listen. Nobody's holding a gun to their head and making them listen or anything like that, right? They voluntarily are there on their own accord listening to Jesus. Good. So you've got a comer and you've got a hearer, but then, lastly, they're doers. They do what Jesus tells them. So they consistently come, they consistently hear, and then they consistently do. Nobody's making them. So if you remember James, if you're familiar with James, you might be going, this sounds a lot like what James said in his letter. Do not be hearers only, but be doers of the word. Be doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. See, that's the right mindset. The right mindset is I'm not just going to come to Jesus, I'm not just going to listen to Jesus, but I am actually going to do what Jesus tells me to do. Many of us have the right words, but the wrong mindset. I'll call him Lord. I may even come to him often. I may even listen to him, right, at times. And when it comes to build my own house, you know what? I got it covered. I can do it on my own. I kind of know that. No need to get deep into the weeds. I got it. And James says here, you are deceiving yourselves. Jesus says you will wreck your life if you do it that way. So on a scale of 1 to 10, rhetorical questions here, just something to think about. Scale of 1 to 10, 1 being awful, 10 being amazing. Right? On a scale of 1 to 10, how good are you at coming to Jesus? On a scale of 1 to 10, how good are you at hearing Jesus, as listening to Jesus? But then finally, on a scale of 1 to 10, how good are you at doing what Jesus has told you to do? About 2 years ago, I would have said, hey, I can score high on all 3 of those. About 2 years ago, I realized I had dramatically overrated myself. So the first element is to have a stable home, a stable house, stable life is building with the proper mindset. I actually am going to do what Jesus tells me to do. The second is having proper motivation. And you may be looking at this text and you're going like, Chris, I don't really see any motivation. He's like, he doesn't say, hey, be motivated this way. There's nothing like that in there, but it's there. It's there. It's actually one of the deepest longings of every heart. Look at the end. Look at the end of verse 48. And when a flood arose, the stream broke against that house and could not shake it because it had been well built. That's our motivation. That's a good motivation. If we have lived long enough, we know that the floods come, the rivers rise. We know that the streams, they're going to break against our house. And what is it that we want? We want to have a house that will withstand the floods. We want to have a house that is going to withstand the rainwaters and the wind and the rivers that are breaking forth across of it, right? We want it to stand firm. We want it to stand unshaken. We want it well built. That is our motivation. It really ought to be. It's okay to have that. It's our motive. Now, Katie will tell you that she has a terrible fear of water. And we're not talking about lakes, and we're not talking about oceans or rivers or anything like that. We're talking about water inside the house. Because water damages. It does a lot of damage. And Katie has experienced enough water damage in our houses to last 3 lifetimes. She does not like water because it can damage a house and damage the things in the house. What a joy it would be for her. It would be almost heaven to have a house that never had water in it. Right? If she was going to buy some land and build a house on it, the first thing, I guarantee you, the first thing that she is going to tell that architect and the builders, and she will not just tell them once, but she will tell them over and over and over again as it's being built, right? The foundation is being laid, right? The pipes are in, everything like that. She will tell them over and over again, now is this going to leak? Is there anything? Don't make this, I don't want this house to leak. Right? She'll do it over and over again. Because there is this deathly fear of water getting into this house. And so is that okay? Is it okay for her to be able to go up to this hypothetical architect or this hypothetical builder and say, make sure that this house is going to be safe from the floodwaters? Is that okay? Is that a good motive? Absolutely. That should motivate us. Not just in our physical homes, but in our lives, our spiritual lives, our physical lives even. It's a good thing. It's a good motive. When we look at this passage in the context, we see that Jesus, from beginning to end, is talking about withstanding these rising floodwaters. Blessed are you who are poor. Blessed are you who are hungry. Blessed are you who mourn. Blessed are you when people slander you, when they speak against you, when they insult you, when they hate you, when they exclude you. Right? I mean, that's some floodwaters. That is hurtful. They are coming against you. That deep inner joy, that excitement that comes in spite of the flood. That's what he's talking about. The floodwaters of poverty and hunger and sadness, persecution can withstand it. At the same time, he says, woe to you who are rich, to you who are full, to you when people like you because you're popular, right? Floodwaters are going to come, and you're going to collapse. So do we want to experience these blessings in spite of the floodwaters? Do we want the rewards of heaven in spite of the rising rivers around us? I think so. I think it's good to want those things. And for whatever reason, we're not really allowing these things to motivate us to build houses on a rock-solid foundation. Now, maybe you have. I don't know. Maybe you have. I thought I did. What we're really doing, what most people are doing, I think, in the Christian community, is that we're simply looking for a spot that's comfortable, looks strong enough. We build our houses on that. But we cannot allow comfortability to be our motive as to how we're going to build. We can't allow strong enough, or decent enough, or good enough to be motivations to build our lives upon. The house that we build, that life that we're building, cannot be done in half-measured, half-hearted ways. You know, when I was learning, I had never done anything regarding renovations or housework when I was growing up. Didn't really know anything about it. Didn't really know it when I was a young adult either. Lived in Indiana. One of the members of our church, that's what he did. I mean, it wasn't what he did, but he built 2 of his own houses. He knew everything there was to do in a house, could do it very well. He was a jack of all trades. He was like not just a jack of all trades, but a master of all trades. I mean, if it could happen in a house, he could do it. He could do the plumbing. He could do the electrical work. He could do the studs and the mudding and the drywall, the whole shebang. He could do everything, tiling, anything and everything, and it looked immaculate. And as he was teaching me, as we were going through and he was teaching me, he would always do this as a joke. He would look at something and he would say, you know what? It's good enough for government work. Right? Or, Chris, you ever hear that? Good enough for, no, you never heard that? Oh, he would do that all the time. Good enough for, or he would say, well, it looks good enough for my house. Right? Because he didn't have to live with it. And that was his way of saying, well, technically, yes, you have met the standards. It's good enough. But if you want to do it right, you want to secure it, you need to go the extra measure, right? And we look at things and we're like, well, it's good enough. It's good enough for government work. I'll build my life on that. It's not good enough. It's not. Let the blessings be our motive for building well. Let the rewards be our motive for building well. Let the unshakable house be our motive for building well. So we've seen 2 elements of a stable house, stable life, proper mindset, proper motive. We come now to that last element of the proper building, and that is the proper, building it on the proper foundation, building it on with the proper material. If we want to build a stable house, we must build it on a stable foundation. So beginning of verse 48. He is like a man building a house who dug deep and laid the foundation on the rock. So if we want a rock-solid house, then we need to build it, of course, on the solid rock. And by that, I really don't just mean we need to build it on Jesus. Apostle Paul says in 1 Corinthians, he says, for no one can lay a foundation other than that which is laid, which is Jesus Christ. And that's true. Certainly 100% true. But in this context, that's not what Jesus was talking about. Jesus isn't actually presenting himself as the foundation. What Jesus is doing is presenting his teaching as the foundation. Maybe that's semantics to you. It's not semantics to me. Because you can say, Lord, Lord, you're my Lord, but then not do what he says, and therefore you're not building on a foundation. That's what I found out. It's very easy to look at 1 Corinthians 3:11 and think, well, of course Jesus is my foundation. But again, all we mean is Lord, Lord. But still don't do what he says. Jesus wants none of that. That's not what Jesus is teaching here. He wants us to dig deep and build on the rock. He wants us to build on his own teachings. Now let's stop for a second and let's think about this for a moment. Because we might tend to think, well, Jesus is really, he's talking about all of his teachings and everything that he's been going through so far and into the future and that kind of thing. But really, if we stop and think about it, the first 5 chapters of Luke, there's really not teachings in there. explanations of why he is doing what he is doing, but he's not actually sitting down and teaching anything. The teaching actually doesn't happen until chapter 6, what we've been going over for the last 9 weeks. Otherwise, it's just, even if you remember his sermon, he's given this sermon, he reads the text, and then he sits down and it is summarized with just simply that this has happened in your presence. That's it. We don't get the teachings of Jesus. We get explanations about why he's doing what he's doing, but he is not sitting down and teaching anybody until chapter 6. And the context of what he is teaching is here what we would call the Sermon on the Plain. Now begins his teaching. And so when he is getting into this teaching, here with the Sermon on the Plain, now he's asking, why is it that you don't do what I have told you to do? We don't see anything that he's told us to do until chapter 6. So what is it that he's been telling him? Well, for the past 6 weeks, we're looking at the Sermon on the Plain, but it's really what we have seen in the last 3 weeks that we see that Jesus is actually giving them commands. He's telling them specifically what he expects of them. Specifically, Christ is saying, you need to love your enemies with an extreme love. You need to show the mercy, the compassion of God. You need to start examining yourself rather than looking at others and what's wrong with them. You need to allow that abundance of Christ's riches to spring forth from the heart. This is what he's talking about. This is the context of what he's talking about. He's just finished with this. It didn't take him too long, right? He's just finished with these words, and he says to them, why are you not doing what I've told you to do? It's as if he could hear the disciples. We're Baptists. We don't say a whole lot during the sermon, right? I don't know what they were. They were not Baptists, I can tell you that much, right? Despite what the landmark controversy, whatever it was, despite what that, Baptists do not go all the way back to the apostles. Okay, I'm just telling you right now, all right? Right? But it's almost like they're, yes, Lord, yeah, like that, good, right? Amen, Lord. Leaning over to their partner, the Lord's got a good point there, right? Why are you calling me Lord, Lord? Why are you agreeing with me on these things, but you're not actually doing these things? Because I think that we would all probably agree with Jesus. Yeah, we should love our enemies. Yep, got a good point, Lord. I should be more compassionate. Yep, absolutely, 100%. I should be more compassionate. I do need to stop being so judgmental. I need to really look at myself. You're right, Lord. Okay, why are you calling me Lord and not doing what I've said? That's the idea here. It's not really Jesus' teachings in general that he's referring to as the rock, and I think that we can apply it to there. Certainly, absolutely, 100% apply it to there. But in this context, this is what he's talking about in particular. And you and I will never withstand life's storms if we don't know how to show extreme love or compassion, or to really look at ourselves before we ever start looking at others. We will fall hard if we only love those who love us, or do good to those who are kind to us, or bless those who are blessing us, praying for those who promise to pray for us. We're going to fall really hard if that's all we're doing, because that's not doing what Jesus has called us to do. He's called us to go beyond that. See, extreme love, that's not found on the surface. It's not a foundation that's going to be found on the surface. To find that kind of love, you got to dig deep. You got to go down further than you would ever think that you would want to even go. And that's going to be hard work. Hard work to get beneath the surface. Like I said, there's no half-heartedness in this job. No measures. Loving those who love you and responding in like manner to those who are cursing you and persecuting you, that's easy. That's surface level. Everybody does that, believer and non-believer alike. They can absolutely love people who love them, and they can respond in kind to people who respond and who revile them and attack them. They can do that. Anybody can do that. To do differently, you got to go deeper. Got to go deeper. We know what happens, right? We know what happens when we stay at surface level. When we stay at surface level love, when we stay at surface level kindness, when we stay at surface level judgmentalism, we know what will happen. Look at verse 49 if you don't. But the one who hears and does not do them is like a man who built a house on the ground without a foundation. When the streams broke against it, immediately it fell, and the ruin of that house was great. Literally, immediately it collapsed, and the wreckage of the house was great. Building on that kind of foundation, just surface, nothing really there, it will wreck your life, believe me. In the Middle East, there are these large areas of land that almost seem like concrete. It's not concrete, but it almost seems like it. It seems almost as hard as concrete. They're called wadis. Anybody ever heard of wadi? Some of you have. If you've been listening to my sermons, you probably have heard it at least once, because I've used it once. Though that was probably 3 or 4 years ago. But anyway, wadi, right? There are these wadis. Wadis are these large pieces of land that basically have been developed because of rivers that are flooding. And so basically it's a natural piece of land. The rivers go over it when it begins to flood. When the rains come down, they all of a sudden get filled up with water, and they can continue the flooding or continue the flowing of the water. And it seems really hard. If you've ever been to Georgia, I mean, we've got clay here in Missouri, but if you've ever been to Georgia, you got red clay. You know why it's red clay? Anybody know why it's red clay? Why? Why is it red clay? Just regular clay. Like you've got brown clay here. Why is it red clay? Anybody know? Yes, it's rust. It's iron. Iron oxide is in the clay in Georgia. That's why it's red clay, right? So you try to shovel through red clay when it's rock hard, and it's rock hard. You're not getting very deep. My little dog, no, it wasn't Pepper. It was Wonder. He had a husky, and he died. She died, and she died, and we had I was talking really loud, and now all of a sudden I'm talking really soft, right? But I loved Wonder, not as much as Pepper, but I loved Wonder, and she died, and she died in the summer. Terrible time for a dog to die in Georgia. Because then you got to bury it. And my brother and I went out there in the backyard of my mom's house to bury Wonder. And after about an hour and a half, we had gotten about 1.5 feet deep. And we're like, that's good enough. Just barely enough. It was tiring. Get down in the red clay. It's hard. But that's kind of like these wadis. And if somebody was to build on that red clay in Georgia, build a house in that red clay, it probably, as long as it was level, right, it could stand for a while until the water came. And then what happens to clay? Doesn't matter if it's red clay or not. What happens when clay gets wet? It gets mushy and sloshy and nasty. And it's no longer as strong as you once thought that it was. Same thing with the wadi. People could build. It could be years, decades, where it hasn't flooded, and people will be like, well, it'll be fine. And they build on these wadi lands, right? And they build up their house. And then all of a sudden, the rain comes and the floods come, and all of a sudden their house gets washed away because they decided that they weren't going to dig down deep and do what was necessary in order to secure their house. And great was the wreckage. They had to pick up the wreckage of their lives because they decided it wasn't worth going deeper. Good enough, good enough. And I have to be honest. 2 years ago, a little bit less than 2 years ago, my life was built on good enough. And in one weekend, my entire life was shattered. It wasn't for people that don't know what's going on, it wasn't a moral thing. But my life was shattered. And great was the wreckage. I was left picking up whatever I could salvage. And I was left angry. I was left hurt. I was left bitter, confused, loathing. And even as early as last September, I was still reeling from it. And I am not saying that I have arrived. I'm more like Paul, right? Not saying that I've already attained it. But forgetting what lies behind, I'm pressing forward to what lies ahead. I will say that in the last year, I have dug deep. I have seen my error. And by God's grace, I have dug deep, and I believe, truly found that foundation on which to build life on. By God's strength, I am rebuilding so that next time, if there is a next time, I'm ready. I will have a rock-solid foundation and a stable home. I wasn't going to bring this up, but I'll bring it up. The course that we are offering, Emotionally Healthy Relationships, was one of the tools that God has used to help me to dig deeper and to find this foundation. And so that's why I highly recommend. It's not the only tool, but it certainly was one of the greatest tools that God has used. So as we conclude Luke chapter 6 and the Sermon on the Plain, I would venture to say that there are some here who have built their lives on a wadi. It seems strong enough, and maybe it is for the little storms. It might be stable enough for now, but you are not ready to find out how great a storm it can withstand. The foundation of your life, just simply surface level, come and listen to Jesus' foundation, but not actually doing the hard work, digging deep down. The doing is never really actually done. Loving brother? Yep, got that, check. Loving neighbor? Yeah, for the most part, yep, got it. Loving enemy? Right? It's kind of how we are. Doing good to people that like you and you like? Yeah, I have no problem with that. Doing good to the people that you really ought to do good to, but, yeah, for the most part, I can do that. Sure, absolutely. Doing good to the people who hurt you. Maybe, if I'm in the right mood. Right? It's not really consistent, really not doing it. Showing compassion, I really got to work on that. Right? Giving, forgiving. There are times where it is really easy because, well, anybody would do it. Anybody would forgive in that case. Anybody would give in that case. Anybody would show compassion in that case. But when it gets hard, well, what are we going to do? Are we going to do as we have heard when we came? So far, if that's all we're doing, though, then we are no different. We are no different foundation than the non-believer, the non-followers, the non-disciples. We're really not acting as if Jesus is Lord. And so it's time to dig deep. It's time to do the hard work, really before your life is wrecked. Because how great is that wreckage? Let's pray.